Have you ever felt forgotten by God? Like the promise he made to you so long ago is now buried under the weight of time, setbacks, and silence? Maybe you've waited and waited, only to see others walk into their blessings while you're still stuck in the wilderness of uncertainty. If that resonates with you, then let me tell you, this is your story. Or more specifically, this is the story of a man who lived through all of that and more, and still believed. His name was Caleb, not a prophet, not a king, not a miracle worker, just a man with a heart that refused to give up on what God had said, no matter how long it took, no matter how dark the journey, no matter how loud the voices of doubt around him became. You see, Caleb's story is not one of overnight victory. It's not a tale of instant success or divine shortcuts. No, it's the raw, honest journey of someone who believed in the unseen when everyone else walked away. In a world where we expect fast results and instant miracles, Caleb shows us what it means to wait well, to hold on when nothing around you gives you a reason to. While others gave up, Caleb kept walking. While they grumbled, he remained faithful. While fear took root in the hearts of millions, faith took root in his. And here's the thing that will shake you. Caleb waited not just a few months or years, but 40 years. 4 decades of silence. 4 decades of watching an entire generation die off. 40 years of rehearsing in his mind the promise of God, with nothing but wilderness dust under his feet. But when the time finally came, Caleb didn't shrink back. He didn't say, "I'm too old for this now." No, he said, "Give me the mountain." The same mountain that once scared a nation into retreat. The land of the giants. The place everyone else avoided. Caleb said, "That's mine. God promised it. I believe him, and I'm ready." So if you've ever questioned whether your waiting has purpose, if you've wondered whether faith still matters when life doesn't move, this story is for you. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand what it means to have a different spirit. A Caleb spirit. A spirit that doesn't surrender. A spirit that remembers what God said, even when the world forgets. This is not just history, this is a divine echo for today. This is the story of Caleb. Caleb was not a name mentioned as often as Moses, David, or Joshua. Yet, he was one of the rare individuals in the Bible whom God himself affirmed as having a different spirit. A spirit that did not yield, that was not swayed by a fearful crowd, and that never wavered in the face of time or trial. And if there is one defining difference between Caleb and the rest of his generation, it is his steadfast faith, even while waiting 40 years in the silence of a promise. The first thing that astonishes people about Caleb is not his military actions, but the calm, deep understanding he carried throughout the wilderness years. Imagine a man who believed in God's promise, who boldly proclaimed that faith before millions, while most of his fellow scouts, 10 out of 12 sent to explore the land of Canaan, spread fear instead. And yet, instead of receiving immediate reward or being ushered into the promised land, Caleb had to suffer the same punishment. 40 years wandering in the desert. There is no injustice more painful for a faithful heart. But what made Caleb great was that he did not complain. He didn't give up. And more importantly, he never forgot the promise. True faith cannot be measured by instant results, but by faithfulness throughout long seasons of waiting and endurance. Caleb lived that out as a living testimony. While an entire generation slowly faded away in despair and weariness, he kept the flame of faith burning for 40 years. We live in a generation that refuses to wait for a promise, an answer, a dream to come true. But Caleb teaches us that perseverance in the Lord is the greatest virtue, for it is the foundation of spiritual victory. The Bible does not record much about Caleb during those wilderness years, but silence does not mean insignificance. We can imagine him witnessing countless funerals, one by one, members of his generation falling, even those who once mocked him for being too naive to trust God. He saw old friends disappear, the once young children growing into warriors, and though his body aged, his faith grew younger by the day. A man at 85 saying, "I am as strong today as I was at 40, was not referring to his muscles, but to an unwavering faith. The second thing that makes Caleb a symbol of faith is his willingness to step into battle. He did not wait to be chosen, and he did not seek to be called. In Joshua chapter 14, As the conquest of Canaan moved into the phase of land division, Caleb personally approached Joshua and said, "Now, give me this mountain as the Lord promised." But this was not merely a demand for rights. It was a declaration of faith. That mountain was not a flat, easy land to claim. It was the dwelling place of the Anakim, giants who had once terrified the people of Israel. Caleb didn't choose the easy path. He chose the hardest, because he knew God had promised, and he believed God could. Caleb's story is not only a model of loyalty, but also a warning to those who let fear overshadow faith. The 10 other spies, they did not lie when they reported that Canaan was full of giants, fortified cities, and skilled warriors. They simply told what their eyes saw and ears heard. But the problem was, they forgot to see through the eyes of faith. They saw challenges, but not the one who could overcome them. And because of their lack of faith, an entire generation was buried in the wilderness, just outside the borders of their destiny. Caleb, on the other hand, chose to view everything through the lens of God's promise. And that is the key that helps us face the giants in our own lives. Maybe it's a long-term illness, a broken relationship, overwhelming debt, or a sense of hopelessness about the future. These things may be very real, very large, and very intimidating. But Caleb did not deny reality. He simply placed his trust in a higher reality, the power and faithfulness of God. Caleb's story also raises an important question for believers today. Do we follow God to receive a reward, or because we are sure of who God is? Caleb did not stay faithful because he thought he would receive land after 40 years. He remained faithful because he knew God was worthy of trust, even when nothing seemed certain. Steadfastness is not an investment strategy. It is the natural response of a heart that truly believes in the Creator. A powerful detail in Caleb's story is that when he defeated the Anakim, he did not fight only for himself. He left the land of Hebron for his descendants. Not only that, but he gave his daughter, Achsah, in marriage to the man who dared to conquer another stronghold, thus passing on a spirit of conquest and faith to the next generation. And the beautiful moment came when his daughter asked her father for more, springs of water to go with her land, and Caleb gladly gave it. A father full of faith will always find a way to ensure that his children not only inherit land but also inherit a source of life, both physically and spiritually. Caleb's story does not end with a heroic anthem, but with a gentle and profound reminder. God never forgets his promises, but he never forces anyone to believe either. People can choose another path, listen to fear, cling to the familiar memories of Egyptian slavery, instead of stepping into the challenge of Canaan. But Caleb chose to move forward, to trust God even during 40 years of silence, to march into the hardest place at an old age, and to live long enough to see that God is faithful. That is why the Bible says, "But my servant Caleb, because he had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land." Numbers 14:4. If you're walking through the wilderness of your own life, waiting for a promise you haven't seen, wrestling with giants only you understand, remember Caleb. You are not alone. And faith is not measured by what happens immediately. Faith is what gives you strength to walk through long, hard years without giving up. Believe this: if Caleb could endure until age 85 to enter the promise, so can you, because God has never broken a promise to anyone who truly obeys him. After 4 long decades, that day finally came. The Jordan River flowed swiftly before the people, a boundary between wilderness and promise, between a memory of trials and a land full of hope. And Caleb, now 85 years old, did not stand back like an elderly man yielding to the younger generation. On the contrary, he walked at the front of the line, no longer with the bewildered eyes of someone leaving Egypt, but with a gaze burning with fulfillment. For him, this wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter, but the confirmation of everything he had once believed, sacrificed for, and endured in solitude. That God truly remembers his promises. The crossing of the Jordan was unlike any other journey in Israel's history. Under Joshua's leadership, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the rushing waters, and instantly, the river stopped, just as the Red Sea had once stopped before Moses. But this time, it wasn't to flee from enemies. It was to advance into victory. There is a clear difference between running away and conquering. And Caleb, who once crossed the Red Sea in the posture of a freed man, now crossed the Jordan in the posture of a possessor. Jericho was the first challenge, a massive fortress with thick, towering walls, a symbol of what seemed unbeatable in human eyes. Caleb, who had stood before this very place 40 years earlier, must have remembered the moment when he and Joshua returned with a hopeful report that was rejected by the fearful crowd. Now he stood before Jericho once more, not as a hidden spy, but as an open warrior. And this time, he was no longer restrained by the people's hesitation. The battle plan God gave to the Israelites was indeed unusual. They weren't told to attack, nor to lay siege, but simply to march. For 6 days, they were to walk once around the city in silence. And on the 7th day, they were to circle it 7 times and blow trumpets. A completely illogical tactic by military standards. But it is within the illogical that true faith is measured. And once again, Caleb, the one who believed in victory before a single battle had begun, now witnessed the walls collapse at the sound of the people's shout. No swords, no ladders, no bloodshed before the fall. It wasn't just Israel's victory, it was the manifestation of God's power. But Jericho was only the beginning. The Promised Land was still full of fortresses, of powerful tribes, and most notably the Anakim, the descendants of giants who once terrified Israel. That was exactly why Caleb didn't choose just any piece of land in the division of Canaan. He came to Joshua and boldly declared, "Give me this mountain where the Anakim live, for the Lord promised that land to me." One can't help but marvel at the weight of those words. They revealed not only unwavering faith, but a soul trained to face the hardest parts. Caleb didn't choose fertile plains or easy farmland. He chose the most dangerous place, the very ground that had threatened Israel's faith for decades. Why? Because he wanted to reclaim what the crowd had once rejected. An 85-year-old man doesn't ask to retire, he asks to be sent to war. That can only happen when he knows victory doesn't come from his own strength, but from the presence of the Lord. With a sword in hand and a fire of faith in his heart, Caleb led his men to battle the Anakim and reclaim Hebron, the land where Abraham had once pitched his tent. And when the final sword of the giants fell, Caleb had not only reclaimed land, he had reclaimed a spirit of victory for an entire people who had once failed in faith. After that triumph, Hebron became home to Caleb and his descendants. But he didn't live like a proud hero. On the contrary, he lived like a father passing on faith. In a particularly moving moment, his daughter, Aksa, asked him for a wedding gift, springs of water. And Caleb, without hesitation, gave her not only the lower springs, but the upper ones as well. He didn't just give his daughter land, he gave her a source of life, a symbol of spiritual inheritance. Here, he was no longer the warrior, but the builder of a foundation for the next generation. Many people today fight to gain property, power, fame, but fail to leave behind a legacy of faith. Caleb was different. He didn't leave behind castles, didn't establish a dynasty, didn't write a history book about himself, yet an entire nation remembers him as a model of enduring faith, of spiritual courage, of one who kept God's promise, even when the rest of the people no longer believed. There's a profound truth in this story that few notice. Caleb never argued with the crowd. When the other spies criticized him, he didn't defend himself. When the people turned their backs, he didn't complain. When he had to wait 40 years, he didn't resent it. And when he received the land, he didn't boast. He let God defend him. That is mature faith. It doesn't need to win arguments. It just needs to win over itself and keep walking in obedience. What can we learn from Caleb? A lot. But perhaps the greatest lesson is this: the delay of a promise is not a failure. It is the environment in which faith matures. If Caleb had received the land right after the first scouting mission, his story wouldn't carry the weight it does today. It's the fact that he had to wait, had to hurt, had to watch an entire generation pass away, and still remain standing. That's what makes his story so powerful. Maybe you're walking through your own wilderness, forgotten, delayed, misunderstood, or watching others step into what you once prayed for. But remember, if God promised, He will fulfill. Not when you want it, but when you need it most. Stay faithful. Keep the fire alive. And if one day you find yourself still standing after every storm, then you are the Caleb of your generation. If Caleb had only been a warrior, his story might have quickly faded into the backdrop of Israel's many glorious battles. But it was precisely because he was a man who kept the promise, kept the faith, kept holiness, and held on to loyalty for over 40 years in the shadows, that he became an eternal witness for all who must wait. And the truth is, none of us walks by faith without facing a wilderness of our own. Caleb's story resonates so powerfully because it doesn't end on the battlefield. It continues in the ordinary life after victory, when he established a family, divided the land, and blessed his descendants. Hebron, where he defeated the Anakim, wasn't just a symbol of conquest, it became a symbol of worship. Caleb didn't build a palace for himself, he built an altar to the Lord. He understood that real faith doesn't stop when the war ends, it continues in the smallest decisions of daily life. One of the most touching details is when Caleb gave his daughter, Aksa, the upper and lower springs. On the surface, this may seem like just a father providing for his child, but in truth, it reflects the mindset of a man who gives not just dry land, but a source of life. It is the picture of a life that passes on blessing, not just possessions. Caleb understood that the land might be fertile, but without water, his children would wither. And on a spiritual level, he knew that our souls also need a heavenly stream, God's word and his presence. So the gift he passed on wasn't just soil, but a guaranteed source of life for the next generation. We can place Caleb's story alongside other great figures in Scripture to see the larger picture that God is weaving. Moses, the man who led Israel out of Egypt, was not allowed to enter the Promised Land due to a mistake at Meribah. That shows us that obedience must be carried out to the very end. Meanwhile, Joshua, Moses' companion and successor, returned with Caleb to give a report full of faith when spying out Canaan. Yet it was Caleb, not Joshua, who personally asked for the hardest land and fought for it himself. When we compare Caleb with Job, we see another shared trait: patience through prolonged trial. Job didn't fight with swords and spears, but with prayer and silence in the face of accusations. And like Caleb, Job went through a season where it seemed God had forgotten him. Yet in the end, God restored him doubly. Caleb too, the promise he received at 40 was only fulfilled at 85. During that time, no one mentioned him. No one praised him. But he lived, and lived in unshakable waiting. In the New Testament, if you look closely, Paul, a man full of zeal, embodied the same spirit as Caleb. When others were afraid of trials, Paul boldly declared, "I know whom I have believed." 2 Timothy 1, verse 12. Paul was abandoned in prison, beaten and opposed by his own people, yet he never backed down. He held firm in his trust that God is faithful. And that is the living spirit of Caleb, in a different form. Back to Caleb. The thing that made him a timeless figure wasn't that he defeated giants, but that he never let the giants defeat his faith. The Anakim didn't simply disappear. They were still there. The question was, who would face them, and who would run? Caleb was the one who faced them, not because he was stronger, but because he believed in the one who is stronger than all. Caleb's story also challenges the fragile, conditional kind of faith that's common today. Many people believe in God when things are easy, when prayers are answered quickly, when miracles happen immediately. But when promises delay, when silence stretches out, when battles drag on for years, they quit. Caleb didn't. He is living proof of one unchanging truth: God never breaks his promises, but we must learn how to wait well. If you're in a season of delay, watching others step into their promised lands while you're still stuck in the wilderness, remember Caleb. Maybe you've been faithful, you've prayed, you've fought, but nothing seems to change. That is exactly when your faith is being refined. No true faith escapes the fire. No growth happens without testing. And no victory truly matters if it didn't first require a delay. Waiting is not stagnation. It is the journey where God refines our inner life, strips away pride, crushes selfish expectations, and purifies our intentions. It was during that time that Caleb didn't let bitterness poison him, didn't let criticism make his heart cold, and didn't let age stop him from stepping into what God had ordained. And then, when the time came, he was ready. No rehearsals, no mental preparation, because he had lived in readiness every day for 40 years. In the end, Caleb's story is a legacy, not a legacy of wealth, power, or fame, but a legacy of faith, one that is still told after thousands of years, inspiring every generation to face the giants in their own lives. We need Calebs in our families, fathers and mothers who don't just feed their children, but teach them how to walk by faith. We need Calebs in our churches, those who dare to rise when everyone else is afraid. And we need Calebs in society, people who don't fear the impossible because they know God never fails. You don't need to do something great to be a Caleb. You just need to hold on to what's right when everyone else chooses wrong. Keep believing when the promise seems out of reach. Keep walking when no one walks with you. And give to God everything you have, even your old age, even the years of waiting. Because in the end, Caleb is not remembered for his talent. He is remembered for having a different spirit. A spirit that didn't bow to fear, didn't break under delay, and didn't drift from the promise of God. Caleb is the symbol of a life of faith that isn't seasonal, but anchored in eternal covenant. He lived, fought, waited, conquered, and left behind a legacy, not for himself, but for a generation chosen by God to enter the promised land. If you're in the wilderness, standing before the walls of Jericho, or facing an attack of your own, know this: you are not alone. And if you hold your faith like Caleb did, then God will fulfill his promise to you, just as he did for him, no matter how long it takes. Now take a breath. Let it sink in. Because what you just witnessed isn't just an ancient tale about conquering land. It's about conquering fear. It's about standing firm when the promises of God seem delayed beyond reason. It's about believing, not with shallow optimism, but with unwavering trust that God finishes what he starts. Caleb didn't win because he was the strongest. He won because he never let go of the word. He didn't survive the wilderness by chance. He endured it with faith. And in the end, when everyone else faded away, he stood tall. Not bitter, not broken, but bold. His story is a mirror. Maybe right now, you're facing your own giants, fears, failures, things that seem impossible to overcome. Maybe you feel like you've been walking in circles, like the land God promised you is always just beyond reach. But remember this: Caleb waited 40 years, and never once did God break his word. The question is, can you keep believing when it hurts? Can you keep trusting when the crowd turns cynical? Can you still say, "Give me the mountain," even when your knees are shaking? Because the truth is, giants still fall. Promises still stand, and the God of Caleb is still your God too. So today I want to challenge you. Stop staring at the walls. Stop counting the years. Start trusting the one who never forgets. Pick up your sword of faith, reclaim your confidence, and when the time comes, and it will, say what Caleb said: "I'm ready, let's go." Because the spirit of Caleb isn't just a thing of the past. It's alive in every believer who dares to hold on when others let go. If this story stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Pass it on. Someone out there is tired. Someone needs a reminder that their wait is not in vain. Be the voice that says, "Don't quit. God remembers." And don't forget to subscribe to Jesus Stories, where faith meets storytelling, and where every episode is a spark to keep your flame alive. We're just getting started. Until next time, stay bold, stay faithful, and remember, the promise still stands.